our topic tonight is Unmasked Inner Beauty. And of course, this is a perfect timing to be talking about this, because who is the heroine of the moment? Of course, is Esther, because she is the central figure of the Purim story. Now, we've mentioned many, many times that in Hebrew, language is not accidental. Hebrew language is the holy tongue. It's God's language. It's the language that are the building blocks of our very existence. The world was created in the Hebrew language. And from the Hebrew language, eventually, it's split into the 70 languages of the world. But therefore, every word and every nuance in the Hebrew language has layers and layers of depth and meaning because it's God's language. So just like God is infinite, the Hebrew language is infinite. So not coincidentally, let me bring this closer so you can see. Not coincidentally, we find something very, very fascinating in Hebrew. Many of you speak Hebrew, some of us more than others, Ophira. What is the word for face in Hebrew? Panim. Okay, so I'll write it in Hebrew and in English. Okay, do we have a working marker? Okay. Panim. Okay, this is in Hebrew, panim. Now, fascinatingly enough, what is a face? A face is what you show to the world, right? Even in English, you say the face that you show to the world. Our face is our external manifestations of who we are, who we manifest to the world. In Hebrew, the word for inner, or what is going on inside of you, is mi bifnim or pnim. Okay? In Hebrew, the word for someone who is a deep, meaningful person, someone whose life is motivated by and dictated by inner ideas rather than external superficial ideas, is called a pnimi, someone who's inner directed. So look how we see two facets of one coin. You see the inner and the external part of a person's personality is expressed in the fact that in Hebrew, the word for internal and external is almost the same word. Change a vowel and you totally flip the meaning on its head, which means that the external you and the internal you are very closely related. Now, for many of us, our internal narrative and our external narrative, there is a dissonance between the two. Our panim does not match our pnim, and our pnim does not match our panim. You can see it even in the English. You see all the letters: pnimi, panim, pei, nun, etc. Pei, nun, mem. That's the root. There is no person that better exemplifies this dichotomy between inner and outer lives than Esther. And we see that even in her very name. Again, going back to the concept that everything is meaningful in the Hebrew language and that there are no accidents and coincidences, and there's deep resonance, especially to one's name. What is Esther's name? Okay, I'll write it in Hebrew, even though my print Hebrew is not. Esther. Now, those of you, is anybody familiar with Jewish history and knows the time period that the story of Esther took place, the story of the Megillah? So, roughly, I'm going to give you Jewish history in 30 seconds or less. Okay? Here we go. So we have, everybody's pretty familiar, I think, with the time down to the Exodus from Egypt. So we'll go creation, then there's the flood, right? Noah and the flood. Then we have our forefathers and foremothers. So we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Isaac, Jacob. And of course, we have the Jewish people, the beginnings of the Jewish people, with Yaakov, Jacob's 12 sons, Jacob's spiritual heir being Joseph, Yosef. which then led the Jewish people into the slavery in Egypt. Coming up is the holiday of Pesach, when we celebrate our liberation from Egypt. After Egypt, we had 40 years in the desert, after which the Jewish people entered the land of Israel, where they were for 850 years. King Solomon, Shlomo Melech, built the Holy Temple. Art was never my subject. Did I happen to mention that? Built the Holy Temple, which stood for 410 years, which was then set on fire and destroyed by the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, in the Jewish year 3338. So bear in mind, we're in the year 5776. 3338 is roughly 438, 2,438 years ago. About 2,500 years ago, the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. Now, when the temple was destroyed, when the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, there was a prophecy. It didn't happen overnight. One day the Jews wake up and, whoa, we were invaded by Nebuchadnezzar. Try saying that 10 times quickly. Then you'll find out the meaning of a tongue twister. Did I ever do that in Hebrew school with you guys? Nebuchadnezzar, 10 times fast. Assignment for the evening. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, destroyed the first temple, took the Jewish people in chains as slaves to Babylon, which is present-day Iraq. Not coincidentally, Saddam Hussein, who was very aware of history, named his nuclear reactor Tammuz 17, the day that the Babylonians entered Jerusalem, and that began the beginning of the destruction of the Jewish temple. Yirmiyahu the prophet, prophesied that the Jewish people would be exiled for 70 years. And those 70 years, it was not, as we spoke about yesterday on Shabbat, those 70 years, it was not clear, thank you, it was not clear when those 70 years began or ended, because the destruction happened in stages. It didn't happen overnight. There was the taking of the Jewish kings were taken in chains, in manacles, to Babylon as prisoners. The prophets were taken as prisoners. 10 tribes were exiled 150 years before the destruction. So when the prophet Jeremiah said that there will be a 70-year exile and then you will return, nobody knew when the 70 years was. It was during this time, after the Babylonians, the Persians toppled the Babylonians, and it is during the reign of the Persian Empire that we have the story of Esther take place. I'm not going to go through the whole story of the Megillah. Most of you are fairly familiar with the general outlines. What I want to pursue tonight is the inner narrative of Esther. Esther, whom I have erased, Esther being the paradigm of the hidden inner self that we all possess. And we see that illusion in her name, Esther in Hebrew. After the whole story occurred and the miraculous salvation of the Jewish people, Esther asked the rabbis, write down my story, and I want this to be remembered and read forever. They said, okay, we'll remember it. And she said, no, I want it written down, and I want it included in the biblical canon. In other words, the 24 books of Tanakh, which we call the Torah today, this was past the time. It was already sealed after the destruction of the temple, because unofficially, the era of prophets came to an end with the destruction of the temple. But Esther insisted. And the sages said, well, how do we know that this is meant to be a part of the Torah? And the Talmud talks about how do we know that the story of Esther is alluded to thousands of years earlier. And there's a verse in Deuteronomy, I can't write that much over here. There's a verse in Deuteronomy that God tells the Jewish people that there will come a time, God says, Vanochi astir et panai. I will hide my face, God says. Esther is the embodiment of a hidden life. Esther is Astir. And And because of that allusion in the Torah 2,000 years earlier, no, excuse me, this was about 1,000 years earlier, the book of Esther became included in the biblical canon. It's considered part of Tanakh till today, and we read it every year for the last 2,500 years on the holiday of Purim. Now, like I said, most of you are all familiar with the story of Esther, but I want to uncover the fairy tale a little bit, like I said, and delve into her inner life. Who was she, and what did she experience? So we all know the fairy tale, Esther, Queen Esther, beautiful girl. She was chosen in the beauty contest from all the thousands of women throughout the Persian Empire, the 127 provinces in Ahasuerus' dominion, to become the queen. And she lived a life of wealth and power and fame. This is our currency today, right? The lives of the rich and famous. So you think that she had it all. But really, Esther's life was a huge tragedy. Her inner narrative was totally different from what appeared externally. Haster Aster, the truth of Esther was hidden. And we see that from the very beginning. Because when she gets taken into the palace, Mordechai tells her, hide your identity. Don't let anybody know that you're a Jew. And the story of Esther parallels the history of the Jewish people. Because this was a time when God's prophecy in Deuteronomy 1,000 years earlier came true. God says, there will come a time when I will hide my face. You will not see God. You will not feel God. Haster, Aster, there will be a double hiding. It will all be the inner workings of my hand. And it is up to you, God tells the Jewish people, to figure that out and to find God's hand beneath the external story. And we see that in the Megillah of Purim, God's name is not mentioned even once. And this is a reflection of God's hiding his face, so to speak. And as we mentioned yesterday in the class, that the literal reason for why God's name is not mentioned is because the whole story of Esther, because she was queen of the Persian Empire, and her son succeeded her. Darius II was a Jewish king of the entire Persian Empire. And because she was queen of the Persian Empire, her story was written into the Persian Empire's chronicles, the history books of the Persian Empire. And therefore, the rabbi said if they wrote the name of God, they would substitute the name of their idol, their gods. And therefore, God's name is totally omitted. But on a much deeper level, what does this tell us? That God is there, but he is hiding. Just like Esther was there in the palace, and she was hiding. So let's go back to the beginning. When Esther was being chosen, when Ahasuerus discarded Vashti, who, by the way, if you look at who Vashti was, she is the ultimate archetype of the modern woman. She was beautiful, she was powerful, she was successful, and she was out there. Okay? When Ahasuerus asked her to display her beauty, he wanted her to display her beauty at his feast without any adornment. That meant literally, come with her crown and nothing else. Now, she had done that before, so she wasn't intimidated by doing that. What she was intimidated by was the fact that she woke up with a rash. So when her external beauty was gone, she had nothing to show for herself. And in defying the king, you see that she not only lost her position as queen, she lost her life. Because her entire value just lay in her external beauty. There were statues of her in the palace. When Esther came, she saw what Vashti had looked like. This is before the age of the internet, even before the age of magazines. So only those people that were actually in the palace had seen Vashti. So Esther had seen that Vashti was externally a beautiful woman. But like we said, once that beauty vanished, there was literally nothing left to her. Now we come to Esther. So Ahasuerus sends courtiers out throughout his 127 provinces and wants to find the perfect queen. Now, Esther was a beautiful woman, we know, but she was also, she was married. Esther was not a single girl. Esther was married to Mordecai. Mordecai had adopted her as a young child, and then as she grew older, and he told her it was time to get married, she wanted to marry Mordecai. And so they got married. And this is another one of those things that are hidden in the Megillah, that it could not be written openly, because can you imagine if it was written in the Chronicles of Persian Media that the king took a married woman and he was living with a married woman as queen? So Esther had a double reason for not wanting to enter the palace. And she acceded, she agreed to do that only because Mordecai told her that clearly this is your destiny. He was her husband and he was giving her up. And she went of her own volition. And she went into the palace, and as we said, the whole narrative of Esther is hidden. And the truth, the inner truth, is something that we have to read between the lines. So while we read in the story, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, and it seemed like everything unfolded very obviously and clearly, it is only with the hindsight and probing between the lines that we find out what the inner narrative is and what Esther's inner life was like. It was 4 or 5 years after she was queen that the whole story of Purim unfolded. So it wasn't bingo, Esther became queen, saved the Jewish people, and we have a holiday. It didn't happen that way. For 4 or 5 years, she had to hide her identity. And there was lots of intrigue going on in the palace. People were constantly scheming to find favor with the king, and at a moment's notice, it could be off with your head. It wasn't one of those things where you had a position in life, you had your pension, you had your tenure, and you were guaranteed job security. That didn't exist. So Esther was constantly on guard for her own life because she saw how quickly her predecessor lost hers. And she knew that she could not reveal that she was a Jewess. And so she managed with great, as we say Yiddish seichel, with great wisdom, with her feminine intuition, she managed to keep her husband, the king, unaware of her background. And he was curious. He kept asking her, who are you? Who are your people? Where do you come from? And she always managed to evade that. And she was able to keep true to who she was as a Jewess in the palace, in the heart of all the intrigue, in the heart of her prison, because that is what her palace became. She was never able to leave and go back to the life that she had before. She was never able to return and live with Mordecai as man and wife afterwards. So really, she gave up her entire life. She gave up the life that she wanted and that she loved for living in a golden prison. And why did she do it? And why was she chosen? If you look at this in this light, you look at Esther's life as a tragedy. And why did it have to be this way? And the reason for it is as follows. We spoke about a little bit yesterday, so forgive me if I'm repeating some of this, but the decree of annihilation came upon the Jewish people for what reason? We know that in the 3rd year of his reign, Ahasuerus threw a huge feast and invited all the peoples in his kingdom to partake. And the Jewish people participated in this feast. And afterwards came the decree of Haman. And why was that so? Because what the Jewish people were celebrating at the feast was their very own downfall. Ahasuerus, at this party, it says, Kirtzon ish v'ish. Anybody had their food, their drink, they drank out of golden goblets. They didn't use a single goblet twice. It was the ultimate luxury. It was the ultimate exclusive invite to the party of the year. And the Jewish people participated. But what Ahasuerus was celebrating was the fact that the 70-year prophecy wasn't coming true. That the Jewish people were not, as their prophets had said, returning to their land, rebuilding their temple, and what they did thereby was cause an enormous Chilul Hashem, which means a desecration of God's name. And this caused a huge breach between them and God. Now, there are certain sins which we do tshuva, we say, I'm sorry, God, I repent, and God says, okay, that's enough. There are other sins that are so severe that it says it requires only death can make up for it. So the Jewish people had a decree of annihilation upon them. But to get rid of that, they needed something of an even greater level of sacrifice. And that was Esther's sacrifice. And what was her sacrifice? Not only did she give up her entire life, but according to Jewish law, as long as she was coerced by Achashverosh to be in her position, she wasn't guilty of doing anything wrong as a married woman. However, the moment she willingly entered into a marital relationship with Achashverosh, she was an adulteress. And there was, this is one of the top 10, right? So what happens? After the decree of annihilation, Mordechai comes to her, and Mordechai tells her, you have to go save the Jewish people. And she says, Mordechai, I can't. Until now, whatever happened to me, I was forced to do. But if I go to Achashverosh willingly, I become, in the eyes of God, in the eyes of Torah, in the eyes of Jewish law, I become an adulteress. So not only was she jeopardizing her physical life, because she was going to go to the king without being summoned. As we know, the law of the land was, the king calls you. You don't make an appearance. Women had nothing remotely resembling equal rights. If she made an appearance in the king's chamber without being summoned, a death sentence was most likely what would follow. So she's telling Achashverosh, she was telling Mordechai, I'm not afraid of losing my life. What I'm afraid of is now I'm going to give up even Olam Haba, I'm going to give up my share in the world to come. Because I am going to be willingly become an adulteress if I submit to Achashverosh of my own accord. And that's why she tells Mordechai, Kasher avadati avadati. A double language of, I'm going to be lost. I'm going to lose my life in this world, and I'm going to even surrender whatever spiritual reward I'm going to get in the next world. I'm going to lose both my physical life and my connection to God. And Mordechai comes back with a very powerful answer. And he says, Mi yodea im ka'et lazot higat lamalchut. Who knows, if not for this moment, did you become queen? This is your moment of destiny. As painful as it is for you to go and submit yourself to Achashverosh, this is why God chose you to be in the palace. And this was the ultimate sacrifice of Esther. Pause for one moment. Fascinatingly enough, we see that Achashverosh ruled over 127 provinces, over which Esther, our hidden Jewess with a hidden life that nobody's aware of, Esther becomes queen of those 127 provinces. And if you look, where else in the Torah is the 127 mentioned? Anybody remember? Yes. Sarah Imenu, Sarah, our foremother. It says that when she died, she was 127 years old. So 127 years old, 127 provinces, nice coincidence. But we know there's no coincidence. Oh, really? Beautiful. Thank you, Esther. So, what does it say about Sarah? Number one, that she was one of the 7 most beautiful women of all time. So already we see a connection between her and Esther. But as a matter of fact, it said Esther fasted so much that she developed a greenish pallor. I think it means she was olive skinned. So apparently what kept Achashverosh attracted to her was her inner beauty, not her external beauty. But Esther lived 127 years old, and it is said that when she was 100, she was as beautiful as 20. So what woman would not give anything to discover that fountain of youth? And what was Sarah's secret? Why was she so beautiful when she was old, like when she was young? because she was connected to her innermost essence, her quintessence, her core, her godly soul, her connection with God. And not coincidentally enough, Esther was also captured by a king, taken into harem, and almost forced to be with him. She was captured by King Pharaoh in Egypt. And she had the strength to withstand her experience, and therefore many generations later, her descendant Esther was able to do what she needed to do in the palace. So let's fast forward back to Esther again. So just to repeat, Sarah's beauty was everlasting because her beauty stemmed from a spiritual source, not from expensive creams from Sephora. Her beauty stemmed from the fact that she was so connected to God. God is everlasting. God is true. Her connection to him was reflected in her physical beauty, which was literally ageless. Now we go to Esther. So Esther says, Mordechai, I will do as you ask. If I have to lose both my physical life and I have to jeopardize my entire spiritual connection to God, my godly core, which is keeping me alive in this palace, I will do it for the sake of the Jewish people. And because her sacrifice was so great, the Jewish people were saved in her merit. And after that, we don't hear about Esther in the history books, except for one very interesting footnote, that Esther and Mordechai were buried together. Mordechai promised Esther that I will be buried with you and you will be buried next to me. That we may not be together in this life, but we will be next to each other, and I promise you that you will have a share with me in the world to come. And Esther lived out her years in her golden cage, in her golden palace, in her prison. Her son was raised as a Persian. She let him know that he was Jewish. He ascended to the throne when he was 7 years old, and when he was he was taken away from her. She went to live in a suburb of the capital. She went to live in a province, and I don't know if anybody's seen, but recently there was like an undercover video that was on the internet of a Persian Jew visiting Esther's tomb. So there's actually an argument of Esther and Mordechai are buried in Persia, which is logical, or if they're buried in the land of Israel. Right? But there is a place that is known as Esther's tomb today in Israel. And I just recently read a fascinating story which I would like to share with you. Esther's tomb was being taken care of by the Persian Jewish community that's still left in Iran after 2,500 years. And one day, a non-Jewish Persian runs over to the rabbi and says, "There's a lady crying inside the tomb. Why don't you go and take care of her?" And the rabbi went inside the tomb, and there was nobody there. The next morning, they wake up and they hear news that World War II had begun. So just like we know that Rachel mivaka al baneha, that Rachel was crying for her children, clearly Esther, as the protector of the Jewish people, was also crying for her children. Okay? So we know that again, if we look at Esther's inner narrative, it was a life filled with sacrifice. She gave up her entire life to save the Jewish people. And it needed that level of sacrifice, of willingness to give up everything, give up her husband, give up her life, give up, she knew that she was not going to have any Jewish grandchildren. Her son was being raised as a Persian emperor. She knew that she had no future, but she did it all because she knew that this was her destiny. Her destiny was to save the Jewish people. So, just very briefly, we all have an inner life and we have an external life. And the way to achieve harmony between the two, the way to true inner beauty, is like both Sarah Imenu, Sarah our foremother, and Esther, that incredibly brave and courageous heroine that gave up everything. Think of her as a human being, a life as a woman, as a mother, as a wife, gave all that up to save the Jewish people. And the way she was able to withstand the pain and the difficulty of all those years of living in her golden prison was by being connected to her essence, to her God, and to her godly soul. And while it says a beautiful woman is an asset for her husband and it brings joy, but our inner beauty is what makes our external beauty shine. So may we all take from Esther's inner beauty and allow that to let our outer beauty shine. Good evening, ladies. Okay, now before I go, I did want to mention something else, that Esther as the paradigm of the Jewish heroine is also a metaphor for the relationship of God and the Jewish people. Because remember, we said that God said, this is a time that I will hide my face. And because of the decree of annihilation, what happened? The Jewish people had an entire year from when Haman threw his lots. Oh, did everybody write their name on a paper in the basket? So we can do our own little Purim? Everybody wrote their name? Did it go around? Oh, Ruthie, one more. Write your name. Here, take the basket. Take the basket and then put in your name. Thank you. So, while God was hiding his face, while God's hands was not evident, there were no open miracles, there were no open prophecies, there was no temple anymore. It went up in flames and the Jewish people had no idea when it was going to come back again. But what happens? The Jewish people had an entire year from when Haman threw his lots until the decree of annihilation was supposed to take effect, God forbid, and they could have saved their lives by converting to the Persian religion. Not one Jew did that. As assimilated as they were, because that's what Haman meant, that they were scattered and spread out throughout your 127 provinces. As assimilated as they were into each of their local cultures, not one Jew decided to renounce his or her Judaism. And what happens after that? It says at the end of the Megillah, Kimu mashakivlu kvar, that they re-accepted the Torah in a way that they hadn't even accepted it at Mount Sinai 1,000 years earlier. That the relationship, the husband and wife relationship between God and the Jewish people became so cemented through their act of sacrifice. They were putting their lives in jeopardy just for remaining Jews, just as Esther did to save her people. And it is this that ultimately led to that much stronger bonding between God and the Jewish people. May we find that bond within us and activate that inner beauty and that connection.